Good evening and welcome to the third event in this year's Talking About Science in the 21st Century public series, focusing on the theme of outsiders. So far, we've met a physicist who studies ant behavior and a neuroimmunologist who studies the relationship between our nervous and immune systems, or what for centuries philosophers have referred to as the mind-body problem. Today, we're taking things in a related but quite different direction, one which will allow us to consider Yogi Berra's great quip that in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. So what do I mean? To most people, evolution is a theory which helps to explain why giraffes have long necks, how whales developed from ancient terrestrial mammals, and what it is that makes ants so successful. Others are aware of the ways in which modern medicine depends on our understanding of Darwin's 19th century theory, for example, in planning and producing a vaccine for a virus. Still others appreciate that evolution is relevant to understanding human cognition and psychology. But few people would say that the theory of evolution applies to humans in a broader sense, to make their cities more efficient, their businesses and schools and governments more successful, or people more happy in general. The application of Darwinism to society has an historical name. It's been called social Darwinism, and social Darwinism, along with eugenics and colonialism, is one of those cardinal sins for which we've all been taught to atone and told not to replicate. Be wary of translating nature onto man, we've learned, or else. After all, what is should not be equated with what ought to be, or as Darwin's bulldog Thomas Henry Huxley put it back in the 19th century, it might seem an audacious proposal to create thus an artificial world within the cosmos. But this is man's nature within nature, sanctioned by his evolution, a strange microcosm spinning counterclockwise. Evolution, in other words, is good for all creatures on Earth, but it should never be a normative guide for us humans. Tonight, our guest is David Sloan Wilson, Distinguished Professor of Biological Sciences and Anthropology at Binghamton University in New York, a world-renowned theoretician and evolutionist. David is known too as the co-founder of the Evolution Institute, which is the world's first nonprofit evolutionary think tank that seeks to apply evolutionary science to social issues. As with his efforts at Pro-Social World, another nonprofit organization which he leads as its president, looking at everything from economic and social policy to the internet age, to entrepreneurship, to failed nation states, to the cities and streets of America, David asks, how can we use evolutionary theory to improve people's lives? Tonight, we'll have the opportunity to ask him that very question, as well as to pose the more critical one, namely, why in God's or Darwin's name is it smart to use the logic of a natural process to guide our cultural development and even our own personal growth. So David, welcome. It's a great pleasure having you with us tonight. I guess it's your noon. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Well, thank you. And thanks for such an interesting introduction, Oren.
I'd like to start with your background. Your father, Sloan Wilson, was the grandson of a US Navy officer and Arctic explorer, and became a well-known writer, author of The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit and A Summer Place, among other novels, and also a passionate advocate for integrating and funding and improving public schools in America. He was a humanist. He was interested in people. Later on, you would say that for you, and this is a quote, science is a way for listening and reflecting on the human condition, much like religion and literature. But to begin with, you gravitated towards the ecology of zooplankton, about as far afield from your father as can be imagined. So how did you become interested in science to begin with?
Well, growing up as the son of a famous novelist is, and you know, I hate to do this, Oren, but my dog is barking outside, and I'm going to, I think my wife's going to get it, that everyone can appreciate that working from home. So I love my dad, but he was such a towering figure, and the idea of doing what he did was just like staring up at Mount Everest. And so I think I became a scientist in part to escape his shadow, but also to indulge my love in nature, because I was lucky to grow up in the midst of nature, beautiful nature on Lake George, which is one of the great lakes, most picturesque lakes in the world, and up in the Adirondacks. And so, I mean, it's a common story, you know, suns sometimes fall far from the tree. Sometimes they do it deliberately. And in my case, I became an ecologist, and I started to study zooplankton. But that was at a time when evolutionary theory, that theory that you just talked about, was in the process of integrating all aspects of the biological world. When Darwin said there is grandeur in this view of life, then that was sort of coming together for the study of ecology and behavior and evolution. And so I discovered that evolution could be a passport for the study of any topic, all subjects, including our own species. And as soon as I appreciated that, then the novelist within me, that urge to understand the human condition, kind of surfaced. And I realized that I could do that through the lens of a theory rather than through the lens of my personal experience. Okay,
so let's talk about that theory, because at the time that we're discussing right now, in the 1960s, Bill Hamilton came out with his theory of kin selection, which was canonized by George Williams and later popularized by Richard Dawkins in a book which I'm sure many in our audience are familiar with, called The Selfish Gene. And you wrote a PhD thesis, which was a very short thesis. In fact, it was a record-breaking 12 pages short thesis. Anyone thinking about writing a PhD, David is your man. He did it in 12 pages, which was a formal argument for group selection. And you were returning to an argument that Darwin himself had made. He had said that evolution can work for the good of the community. But at the time, you were actually going against the tide, because group selection, which is, again, the idea that evolution can work at for the good of the group, not necessarily for the good of the individual, was considered a fuzzy idea in those days, because groups were always vulnerable to selfish individuals. And people came to believe, perhaps due to the genius of the metaphor that Dawkins used, that selfish individuals were actually the marionettes of selfish genes. So could you please just tell us briefly how you came to be a proponent of group selection and what you learned from it about the applicability of evolutionary biology to human culture in particular?
Okay, Aaron, so that's a tall order, but let me head in. Going back to Darwin, that Darwin knew nothing about genes. For him, evolution was about variation. Organisms vary in just about anything you could measure. Selection, those differences make a difference in terms of survival and reproduction. And replication, offspring tend to resemble their parents. Darwin didn't know why, but everyone knew that they did. And so he knew nothing about genes, and he also when we make a distinction between, for example, genetic evolution and cultural evolution, and even personal evolution, none of that would make any sense to Darwin. Darwin definitely thought that his theory could explain all aspects of humanity in addition to the rest of life. I love thinking of Darwin at the age of 29 years old, scribbling in his notebook, "Origin of man now proved. He who understands the baboon will do more for metaphysics than Locke." I mean, just imagine somebody thinking of those vistas in front of him, all making sense from this, this perspective that he had discovered. But soon enough, he discovered that his theory could not explain a very important class of behaviors, namely everything that we associate with pro-sociality. Anything done for the interest of others or one's group as a whole necessarily places the pro-social individual at a disadvantage compared to the more self-serving individual. So this was a problem of the first rank for Darwin. And he came up with a solution, which is not hard to describe, namely that even though evolution at the smallest scale among individuals within a single social group favors selfishness, if we think of groups competing with other groups, then the most altruistic, cooperative, pro-social groups will robustly outcompete other groups. And so Darwin solved his own problem with a theory called group selection. And so now what happened in the 1960s, which you know well, and this was the age of individualism in evolution. George C. Williams, who you mentioned, came up with the theory of individual selection. He said that group selection can occur. I mean, there's nothing logically wrong with it, but in practice, lower level selection is always more powerful than higher level selection. And then Hamilton came along and explained even altruism as a form of selfishness, that the altruist is maximizing its genes in the bodies of other individuals. And then Dawkins came along with his selfish genes, that what individuals do is they're maximizing their selfish genes. And so everything that evolves can be interpreted as a form of individual and gene level selection. And there was a kind of a triumphalism in this, a kind of a zeal with which evolutionists reached this conclusion. And with time, the best way that I've come to understand that is a part of a larger trend of individualism. That individualism, the idea that everything can be explained in terms of individual thought and action, all things social can be reduced that way, pervaded not only evolution during that period, but economics and the social sciences and everyday life. So when Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s said there's no such thing as society, only individuals and families, and when economists talk about homo economicus, this is all a broad intellectual tradition, which has been the proverbial water that the fish can't see for the last 70 years. We have to go back further than that to the age of 19th century people like Durkheim and the like, in order to see an alternative view, a more organicist view of society, which is basically that society is an organism in its own right. So that view is not new. That view is actually quite old, but the scientific underpinnings and justification for it is new, as we will get to.
Right. And so, so basically, if we go to the evolutionary process itself as applied to humans, we share close to 99% of our genes with chimpanzees, and yet there's really a night and day difference between us and chimpanzees when it comes to certain things. So for instance, in laboratory experiments, you see that chimpanzees are completely disinterested in each other's welfare. So like if you give them a choice between a reward for themselves and the same reward from themselves plus a reward for another chimpanzee, they're indifferent, they don't care. We are different. We've self-domesticated ourselves to the degree that we've become hypersocial by cooperating in the hunt, with child rearing, by creating norms, punishing systems, and also, crucially, cultural systems that are based on symbolic thinking that have been internalized to an astonishing degree. And so you take this understanding of group selection for our species, and and you begin to do something quite unusual with it. Once you've theorized it, you've satisfied yourself that the theory of group selection, that it can actually happen, that selection can see a group as if it were an individual, that is a possibility. Not only a possibility, it's an eventuality. It happens in nature. But then you have what you call a road to Damascus moment. You've spent a career studying the fundamental problem of how altruism, how cooperation, and other traits that are good for the group can evolve. You've also studied the evolutionary origins of all kinds of human characteristics like gossip, like decision-making, like physical attractiveness, even religion, which you interpret as a kind of group-selected adaptive trait. But then you have this road to Damascus moment when you say, wait a second, maybe all these ideas, which are quite academic, might actually be applicable to the world beyond the ivory tower. And you've theorized a category, which you call variation, selection, replication processes, and which to your mind all adhere to evolutionary principles, even if they seem quite far removed from them at first glance. And I want our audience to understand, in the first instance, before we get to the application of this category, how this works exactly. Can you give us the theory in as simple terms as possible?
Well, Oren, you ask such easy questions. There is so much to cover here. I want to begin with the grand narrative that you sketched out. And it is a truly grand narrative that not only covers human evolution, why we're so much more cooperative than our closest relatives, but all the way back to the origin of life. So I want to establish the idea of what's called major evolutionary transitions. And so the picture we've given so far is that evolution can operate at more than one level. At the smallest scale, it produces selfishness. At the higher scale, it produces within group cooperation, always within group. And so most species are just a mosaic of selfish and cooperative traits. But that balance between levels of selection is not static, but can itself evolve. And something that happens very rarely is that mechanisms evolve that suppress the potential for disruptive within group selection, so that between group selection becomes the dominant evolutionary force, and those groups become so cooperative that they actually become a higher level superorganism. And this was beyond Darwin's imagination. Darwin and everyone else thought that individuals evolve by small mutational steps from other individuals. But the idea that individuals could evolve as highly cooperative groups was beyond everyone's imagination until the 1970s, when it was proposed for the evolution of nucleated cells as symbiotic communities of bacterial cells. And then the idea was generalized, not until the 1990s. And one thing I want to give is a sense of the recency of all of this. Even though Darwin's theory is 162 years old, what we're talking about now is like 10, 20, 30 years old, which is why a lot of people don't know about it. So this idea of major evolutionary transitions was generalized to include such things as the first cells, the origin of life as groups of cooperating molecular reactions, social insect colonies, and human evolution. And so the big difference between a human community and a chimp community is social control. In a chimp community, naked aggression occurs 100 to 1,000 times more frequently than in a small-scale human community. The way to dominance in a chimp community is just to be physically dominant. But in a human community, if somebody tries to be a bully, they are usually collectively suppressed by the other members of the group. This is called reverse dominance. Nowadays, it's being called self-domestication. But what you can see it's a major evolutionary transition, because if you can't just bully your way in a group, then the only thing that's left is teamwork. And so teamwork became the signature adaptation of our species. We are evolution's newest genetic major evolutionary transition. And then just about everything distinctive about our species is a form of cooperation, either physical cooperation, such as hunting, gathering, childcare, all that, and also mental cooperation. In fact, all of our cognitive operations, which in the age of individualism, we assume, our memories, our perception, how we categorize things, how we make decisions, without thinking, we assume that these are all things that take place in a single person's head, when in fact, each and every one of those is highly influenced by social processes. And what's influenced most of all, and which couldn't exist without cooperation, is our capacity for symbolic thought and to pass symbolic meaning systems from one generation to another. And so the very capacity for culture, which exists to a limited degree in many species, exists to a much greater degree in our species and became a full-blown evolutionary process in its own right. And so now, when we get to those three words, variation, selection, replication, we see that they apply to the evolution of our cultural traits and our symbolic meaning systems, no less than our genes. And what qualifies any process as Darwinian is when the process includes those three ingredients. When you combine variation, selection, and replication, then adaptation occurs. The properties of the species changes, and it changes in the direction of becoming better adapted to its environment. That's true for cultures, it's true for genes, and it's true for our personal behavioral flexibility. And I don't want this to sound like I'm the only one thinking this way. This is a very large consensus view, and even figures such as B.F. Skinner, the father of behaviorism, this is how he thought. He wrote a paper in 1981 titled Selection by Consequences in Science magazine. And the whole point of that paper is that there's something that genetic evolution, cultural evolution, and individual behavioral flexibility all have in common. They all shape, they all basically are the shaping influence of selection by consequences. If we want to know how you behave, then we need to look at the history of environmental forces operating upon you, your genes, your culture, and yourself.
Okay, so a lot of people would agree with what you just said. As you said, there's a wide consensus about this. However, you are unique in taking this foundational theory and sort of theoretical understanding and applying it to the world. So what I want to do now is, the title of this event is Planning a Darwinian City. And I want to go to some concrete real world examples. And to start with, a book and a project that you started about a decade ago, which was called the Neighborhood Project, using evolution to improve my city one block at a time. The said city is Binghamton, New York. And I know that this has grown much wider and gone other places, and even more successfully in other places. But you and your team were interested in a measure that you've already referred to, which you call pro-sociality. So please explain that to our audience.
Well, I'll do that in less than a minute, Oren, but I have to correct one misimpression about me being the only one again. And you can appreciate this because you're a historian of ideas, and you know how complicated the history of ideas can be. And so if you go back to that tradition of behaviorism, what you find is, of course, it has enormous practical application. You know, there's behavior cognitive therapy, and the behavior of that is Skinner's behaviorism. But what happened in academic psychology was that behaviorism had its day, and then, strangely enough, in the second half of the 20th century, was somehow replaced by something called the cognitive revolution. And behaviorism didn't go away, but it got almost banished to the applied behavioral sciences, where in fact it's thrived because it's so darned useful that we can't really do without it. And then it was supplemented with cognitive therapy, so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to say here is that there's an entire archipelago of applied behavior science disciplines operating at all scales, individuals, groups, and entire populations, which is very successful. And I had to discover that for myself. So when I left the ivory tower with my distinctly modern evolutionary perspective, that was indeed, there was something fresh about that, but I was joining these other disciplines with longer histories, some of them stretching back to pragmatism, you know what that is, a philosophical tradition that was directly inspired by Darwin, people like William James and John Dewey. We really have to function as good scholars here, and you can appreciate that. But now let me go back to Binghamton and to say exactly what I did with my theory of group selection. And so no matter how you frame it, whether in terms of Hamilton's theory or group selection theory, what we can say is this: if you think of prosociality as a social strategy that competes with more selfish social strategies in some kind of Darwinian contest, you can say this, that a highly prosocial individual can thrive as long as they're in the company of other high pros.
Please explain, but what is a high pro for our audience?
A high pro is an individual that just loves helping others. They are other-oriented. I want to help you. I want to help our group. I'm not going to try to get stuff for myself that's harmful to other people. I'm a highly prosocial individual. Prosociality is anything that's oriented towards the welfare of others or one's group as a whole. And if you measure it, which is easy enough to do, you could measure it in a survey, you could measure it in terms of actual behavior. If you measure prosociality, which we did in all of the public school students in Binghamton, New York, guess what you find? You find a bell-shaped curve. You find that there's some Mother Teresa's out there. There's some people you wouldn't want to run into on a dark night. And most people are in between. And so now to that question, if you think of prosociality at your degree, where you are on that bell-shaped curve, as a social strategy competing against other social strategies, highly prosocial behavior, highly prosocial individuals can thrive as long as they're in the company of other highly prosocial individuals. It's only when they get depredated by less prosocial individuals that there is a disadvantage. And so what we're looking for is a correlation between the behavioral disposition of the individual and their social environment. So we collected that information. How prosocial are you? And how prosocial is your family, neighborhood, church, school, and extracurricular activity? That's your social environment. And what we discovered for the first time, so now this is now more new territory, is a very, very strong correlation in a modern American city. The correlation between how prosocial you are as an individual and your social environment was about 0.7. And the reference mark there are, and you know, is in Hamilton's rule, R equals 0.5 is the correlation that exists among full siblings. So in a sense, the matching between the individual and the individual social environment was greater than the matching in a kin selection model with simple genetic assumptions. So that's a little bit of jargon that we don't need to.
Okay, so let me just try to explain this to the audience. So So we know that prosociality changes to match the immediate environment. So if you're living in a neighborhood where a lot of people are prosocial and help, they help garden the communal garden, and they help other kids go to school and so on and so forth, then the chances of you becoming prosocial rise. And it also tracks with lower crime rates and a healthier environment for children, and with stronger social cohesion and mutual responsibility and solidarity, something which we've learned is very important in these COVID days. That makes sense. That makes sense even to someone who doesn't know anything about evolutionary theory. But how do you use the theory to go about increasing the prosociality?
Well, here we get to something that's very important about moral systems. So first, I want to say something about moral systems, which is a philosophical topic, and then immediately apply it to real world situations, just to show you the connection between a deep philosophical issue and its practical applications. A long time ago, I had a conversation with the moral philosopher Simon Blackburn in Oxford, I think. He's the Bertram Russell Professor of something or other in England. And I said, Simon, before we talk about morality from an evolutionary perspective, just define morality for me, please, as you would in an introductory philosophy class. And he said, well, there's two dimensions to morality. There's a compulsory dimension. A moral community has norms, and you're expected to abide by those norms. And if you don't, there's punishment. There's consequences. And so there's an obligatory dimension to morality, but there's also a voluntary dimension in which we want to help others as an end to itself. We're motivated by sympathy, something that Darwin wrote extensively about. Empathy, love, friendship, that just makes us spontaneously want to help others. And so I love that so much, because it's exactly what you would expect and what has evolved from an evolutionary perspective. They need to go together for the following reason. If you do not have the compulsory dimension, then it's just dangerous to be prosocial in the voluntary sense. We've already said that prosociality is vulnerable, makes you vulnerable. You can't extend yourself to others without placing yourself in a vulnerable position. In the absence of the compulsory dimension of a moral system, then most people look around them, they realize that they can be exploited, and like any sensible turtle or snail, they pull into their shell and they withhold their own prosociality. But if they see that there's a strong structure to their society, which makes it disadvantaged to misbehave, then they can freely express themselves. So in a way, in fact, a very useful way to think about a moral system is like our immune system. Our immune system is elaborately protecting us from diseases. Most of the time, it's just resting there, but it's ready to kick in whenever it's challenged. And so we could think of our moral systems as like an immune system defending us against selfish disruptive behaviors, ready to kick in. Now, knowing that, then we can now look at our groups, such as the neighborhoods that I studied in the city of Binghamton, and we could examine those social environments, and we could ask, how well are those social environments protected against disruptive behaviors? Is there actually a moral system functioning on the ground in those social contexts where people are living? And that's what you can build in. That's where you can now flip into social planner mode. And you can go to any group and you could examine that group for how well it's basically implementing a moral system that's protective against disruptive behaviors. And it turns out that groups vary. You get a bell-shaped curve for that too.
Okay, but can you make this more palpable for us? What does it mean to look at the moral structure of the group? And what does it mean? You compare this to an immune system. So, every time the winter comes around, we take shots to boost our system. What do we do to boost our our moral group strength.
So here I want to introduce Eleanor Ostrom to our audience. I hope she's known to some of them. She's a political scientist who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009, but she was a total outsider, still largely ignored by economists. And she studied the famous tragedy of the commons, the tendency of groups utilizing natural resources to take more than their share. And very briefly, she showed that by studying groups around the world who attempt to manage common pool of resources, that in the first place, they varied in how well they were able to avoid the tragedy of the commons. And in the second place, the ones that could successfully manage their resources shared certain design principles, which she called core design principles. And she listed 8 core design principles, which were the recipe for these groups to manage their common pool resources. And Lauren, I probably it's best for me just to list them quickly in order to make sense, because they're easy to understand. And when I do, let me ask your audience to have 2 things in mind. First of all, some group that you know well. Okay, so bring a group to mind that you know well. It might work well, it might work poorly. And secondly, when I list these core design principles, think of it in the context of what we have just said in terms of an immune system that is protective against disruptive bullying and other forms of self-serving behavior, okay? And then I think we can answer your question. So here are the 8 core design principles. Number 1, a strong sense of identity and purpose. Almost all human groups are socially constructed. So unless they see themselves as a group, they know its boundaries, they know who the member is, all of that, then it's not going to work well. Number 2, benefits proportional to costs. If some members are doing all the work and other members are getting the benefits, well, that's a recipe for unfairness. That is disruptive self-serving behavior. Number 3, fair and equitable inclusive decision-making. Not sustainable if some members get to make the decisions and other members are cut out. Not only is that a recipe for unfairness, but it doesn't make use of the wisdom of everyone in the group. Number 4, monitoring. Unless we can monitor our good behavior, then of course all bets are off. Number 5, graduated sanctions. If we're misbehaving, something needs to be done about it. It can start out gentle and friendly, but it must escalate if necessary. Number 6, fast and fair conflict resolution. Conflicts will occur and they must be resolved quickly in a manner that's regarded as fair by all parties. In a dispute, most people think they have a point of view. Number 7, local autonomy. A group has to have elbow room in order to do these things. This is the principles of federalism and subsidiarity come into play here. And then finally, 8, appropriate relations among other groups, which reflect the same core design principles. This means the core design principles are scale independent. Now, with apologies for going so fast, I think that if you could imagine a group that strongly implements those core design principles, and then imagine someone trying to misbehave in that group, it will not go well for them. And knowing that, the more solid citizens, the more pro-social members of the group can come out of their shells and freely express their pro-social behavior. So when you create that social environment, then individuals blossom.
Okay, so this is super interesting. And I've also found the core design principles that Ostrom used looking at places like fisheries and pastures and forests, places where there could be a tragedy of the commons, to be very persuasive. But someone who was trying to be a bit tough would, might ask you, what does any of this have to do with evolutionary theory? Don't positive change methods just converge on better practices? And I think that your answer is that what works in one context, say in the business world or agriculture, isn't always transferable to another world, say education or government, because each has developed a kind of specialized language and practice, Each regulates itself differently. None are really able to see the commonalities beyond the differences. And so what's needed, therefore, is a more generalized theory to support all these different arenas. And you call this theory the multi-level selection, or multi-level cultural evolution theory. And before we go, let's take it, to another arena. Please explain what this theory is, and also provide another real-world example. Let's say, from the realm of failed nation states or something like that.
Right, Arn. Well, you did some of my work for me when you just talked about what I like to call the archipelago of knowledge and practice. That the world is full of practices that work. That's what cultural evolution is all about. But they're all stated in a limited language that ultimately creates boundaries around them. They're very much like species. A species originates, it spreads on the basis of its success, but then it comes up against boundaries, which are its geographical distribution, beyond which it is unknown. And if you take someone like Eleanor Ostrom's work, it's a body of knowledge that originated in a particular discipline, political science, only one school of thought within that discipline, spreads a little bit into economics, but not much because of more boundaries. And to this day, her ideas are mostly limited to the study of common pool resource groups. And it took someone like me working with Ostrom for 3 years prior to her death to say, wait a minute, what you've shown for common pool resource groups should hold for all forms of cooperation. Cooperation in all its forms is a common pool resource. Any group whose members need to cooperate to get things done are vulnerable to these kinds of depredations. And so therefore, and this is a scientific hypothesis, by the way, it's a prediction that if we repeat what Ostrom did for any kind of group, I don't care what, then we will find a bell-shaped curve in how well they function. And that bell-shaped curve of performance will map onto how well they implement these core design principles. So we've tested that hypothesis, and it's true. So, and by the way, it turns out that business groups, although they need the core design principles as much as any other kind of group, on average, they are deficient in their implementation for all 8. We've shown that. So there's something about business groups that are especially lacking in the core design principles. And if you ask why, the answer is almost certainly the influence of another theory, orthodox economics theory, which causes you to see the world in a very different way and leads to such things as the shareholder value model and top-down command and control governance and so much more, which end up violating the core design principles. So here's a theory which has incalculable benefits in the business world, along with any other kind of group that you might mention. And Oren, let me just relate the first thing I did in Binghamton, based on these core design principles, was we helped design a school for at-risk high school students. These were students that had failed for the 2 previous years and would almost certainly drop out if something wasn't done. We built a school that was basically designed around the core design principles. So we provided this safe and secure social environment that allows individuals to come out of their shell. And do you know that despite a lifetime of hardship, the students in that course, given the suitable social environment, did much better than the control group in a randomized control trial, and even did on a par with the average high school student in the city of Binghamton. And so this is very optimistic that people retain enough behavioral flexibility so that if you provide this secure, safe and secure social environment that makes it safe to be pro-social, most people, like a turtle or snail, they come out of their shell and they do it within weeks.
Right. So, okay. So basically what you're telling us, David, is that multi-selection multi-level selection theory is really about identifying units of functional organization. And your claim is that groups, alongside individuals and genes, can serve as such units, but that everything depends on context. In other words, if we want to understand honeybees, then we need to go above the level of the individual organism to find the unit of functional organization. If we want to understand cancer, we need to go below the level of the individual organism to find the unit of functional organization. And if we want to make our groups more cohesive, the human groups that we all inhabit, be they, a school, a neighborhood, a church, a family, a firm, then what we need to do is really to change attitudes, really very deeply ingrained attitudes, normative attitudes and attitudes towards our goals. So to really uproot a kind of Milton Friedman type economic individual self-maximizing psychology, a kind of Ayn Rand type psychology with a more collectivist ethos, what that means is we need to impact the way people think about love and empathy and respect and loyalty and trust. And we need to change the way they approach fear and anger and possessiveness and even lust or libido. And this is something that's very, very hard to do. Because it seems to me that the theory, okay, we have the theory in place now. And we spoke about this yesterday when we were discussing. We have the theory in place. But when it comes down to actually applying it at the local ground level, then there comes a point where you sort of have to put the theory aside, don't you, in order to deal with, really local practicalities. The teacher who's a terrible teacher, but he has an enormous ego and won't leave the kids alone, gives too much homework. The pastor who doesn't like particular members of the group and therefore is unfriendly to them and doesn't provide the kind of environment that is conducive to creating that group cohesion and so on and so forth. What do you do then? What do you do with what happens to the theory and where do we go from here? Sorry. And how is evolution, related to all of these, small but important problems?
Evolution is causing us to have this whole conversation. Right. So someone said to me once, suppose I use a flashlight to find a key, and I give you the key, and you say, "Oh, this key is so useful. Why do I need a flashlight?" So there's a sense in which evolution is the flashlight. Evolutionary theory is the flashlight that's producing all of these useful prescriptions. People take the prescriptions. They don't need evolution now, but how did that prescription actually emerge so strongly as a prediction? But I want to go back, Oren, to this idea of symbolic thought and what's called dual inheritance theory, that there's two streams of evolution in our species, a genetic stream and a cultural symbolic stream. And I'm going to get directly to what you were talking about. So each and every one of us is a collection of genes. We call that our genotype. Those genes influence the way we are. Anything you could measure about us, we call that our phenotype. And so if you're a biologist, you know all about the genotype-phenotype relationship. But because we're humans, each and every one also is a collection of symbols, call that our symbotype. We could also call it our worldview, our meaning system, but it's basically everything in our heads, which influences the very same phenotype. And the way we are, what you can measure about us is influenced by our symbolic systems, at least as much as our genes, and they interact with each other, not only through evolutionary time, but within our lifetimes. Our symbolic systems are upregulating and downregulating our genes. A course of meditation can alter very sizable fraction of your genes as far as their expression is concerned. And so when we think of our symbolic systems as like our genes, there's a metaphorical transfer that takes place in which, again, the utility of thinking about this as an evolutionary process in which we can appreciate perhaps better than before the need for inner work, the need to, which is what you emphasized, Doreen, the need to change how we think about things in order to change our behavior. And of course, it's much more easy to work with symbotherapy than it is to work with gene therapy. But the idea is the same. In just the same way that you could surgically implant a new gene and then perhaps solve a disease, we can think of actually surgically altering our symbolic systems and solving our problems. Now, what do we mean by symbolic systems? There's a whole diversity. For example, a theory can be a symbolic system. And so, what a theory suggests that we do is hugely influenced by the nature of the theory. That's why orthodox economics theory motivates a whole suite of behaviors, and one based on multi-level selection theory motivates a whole other suite of behaviors. Einstein said that theory decides what you can observe, but a theory can also be, a symbotype can also be a religion. And so—
yeah. Einstein also said that if the facts don't fit the theory, get rid of the facts. So when you say to surgically manipulate our symbotype, I would venture to say that freaks out a lot of the ears of the audience, because you like to present this as a kind of form of, I would say, pragmatism married to behaviorism, married to maybe public health and epidemiology at the scale of whole populations. And you
at all scales are, the scale of the individual person,
right,
small groups, all the way up.
Right. And you call this a kind of third way. It's, to your mind, it's neither top-down centralized socialism, nor is it bottom-up laissez-faire capitalism. And my question to you is, okay, but how is managing our lives through evolutionary principles not a form of social control? And why should we trust those purporting to know the science? Because after all, science is never free of its political and economic context. You yourself started out without saying that, the idea of individualism was so ingrained in the 60s and 70s that it found itself manifesting in many different fields, including in evolutionary biology and the selfish gene concept and so forth. And the history of science amply demonstrates, in case after case, from Ptolemaic astronomy all the way to global warming, that we should be afraid of the experts to some degree because they're implanted in their cultures. So what's your reply to anyone who's a little bit freaked out by this?
Yeah, well, this is just the conversation we should be having. So you're asking good questions, and I have good answers for those questions. So, and I'll put it to you. You can be my devil's advocate, okay?
Sure.
And there's a certain amount of progress that we can make very easily without using the E word, because a lot of this is common sense, at least, once you get from a particular perspective. So my first question to you, my devil's advocate, is doing nothing an option?
No.
Thank you. So we have to do something. Now, what's scary and threatening about social Darwinism, social engineering, social control, experts in all their form, is done to rather than done with. So when we decide to do something, then please let it be what we decide to do, not what you tell me to do. So I'm actually not relying on any expertise in that sense. Decision-making, we've already said, as part of the core design principles, is that a group the decision-making needs to be fair and equitable. That means it needs to be participatory. It needs to be democratic. Everyone is a moral equal in what we decide to do. And then after we decide to do something, actually, it still might not turn out well because the world is full of unforeseen consequences. That's why centralized planning doesn't work. So we have to be humble. Everyone has to be humble, including the scientists. But nevertheless, especially when it comes to technical problems such as global warming, how to run an economy, how to prevent a disease pandemic, of course we need the best of our scientific knowledge. And so that's what we do. We're cautious, we're experimental, we try things out. First of all, we decide by consensus what to do. We make sure that it's equitable. And then we cautiously try out solutions. And we do it in a way that we can assess the consequences, which is very difficult in its own right because it's a complex system. So all kinds of science and technology has to come in just to find out what the consequences of our actions are. Mm-hmm. And then we proceed, we iterate that again and again and again. And what would that be but a managed process of cultural evolution? Call it what you like. Call it an experiment. Call it pragmatism. But what it is a orchestrated process of variation, targets of selection, and replicating best practices. And so in some sense, we've been doing it all along, but in another sense, we need to be more mindful about what we're doing than ever before. And we need to apply it at higher scales. By that, I mean the global scale. That's another thing that multi-level selection makes very, very clear is that altruism permutes to selfishness. Mm-hmm. Self-interest is great until it becomes self-dealing. Helping family and friends is great until it becomes nepotism and cronyism. Growing our economy is great until it overheats the earth. And so adaptation at one level permutes to dysfunction at higher levels. And so therefore, the good of the planet must be the primary object. And then everything underneath it needs to be calibrated with that in mind. That's a very strong prediction that emerges from multi-level selection theory, if it wasn't obvious before.
Okay, so I'm still playing the devil's advocate, right? I'm still,
if you like.
So here's the kind of historian in me asking, you say, okay, the only way to affect positive change in this world at different levels, as opposed to laissez-faire on the one hand, centralized planning on the other, is through this process of setting systemic goals, which are basically targets of selection, orientation of variation around this target, and then finally reproducing best practices again and again and again. That's what you just told us. And you say that this is the only thing that can work logically, and therefore it's the only thing that has worked in human history. But when I look at human history, when I look at the reforms of Cleisthenes or of Alfred the Great, when I look at the visions of Martin Luther King or of Gandhi, or the achievements of the feminist movement and the animal rights movement, they do not look to me like this considered process at all, but rather more like a series of starts and stops, fumbles, meanders, individual charisma, mixing hopelessly with human frailty. And from this perspective, your vision seems just a tad too logical. So what's your response to that?
Oh, we need another hour, Aaron, and we don't have it. So I think we're, are we due up in 2 minutes? Is there?
We'll take about 10 more minutes because I do want to discuss your book. So we have about 7 or 8 more minutes.
Oh, yeah. Good. Okay. So let's, so these are great points, and evolution, in the first place, the idea that evolution has any conscious purpose at all was taboo in evolutionary biology. And so it's actually new to think that evolution can be consciously directed at all. But in the case of human cultural evolution, the answer is, of course it is, at least to a degree. And so what I'm claiming about this needing to be a conscious process actually fits with what you're saying, because conscious intentions very often collide, and then that becomes unintended. So there's an element of both. And again, I feel the crush of time, but in my own work in Darwin's Cathedral, I studied the Protestant Reformation, and there you have Protestant reformers like John Calvin, who was explicitly trying to tailor religion to his city of Geneva. He was trying to make Geneva work better as a city, and his catechism and his ecclesiastical ordinances and stuff was straight up designed by an individual trying to make the city work. That's the part of what I'm saying. On the other hand, because of so many conflicting forces and so on and so forth, it was essentially unpredictable whether his efforts would succeed, somebody else's efforts, such as Zwingli in Zurich, failed. So there's a sense in which this unintended component comes in. And I have conversations that are available online in which I talk about this kind of thing with Peter Turchin and also with Tim O'Reilly on the internet age. So Tim is an internet pioneer. And so he was kind of present to the fact that some things happen and they happen by intentions. People are trying to do things, but they open up entire new adaptive radiations that were definitely unforeseen. And those get cascading off in all these directions. So there's actually room for both of what we're saying. And I think that, and although it takes a little while to reconcile them, I think that actually what these two positions, which seem at odds, actually can go together. And they also go together, for example, in the distinction between micro and macro evolution, just in evolutionary biology.
All right, so I'm willing to buy that, and it does necessitate a little bit more, mastication, but fair enough. And we do have just a bit of time left, so I really wanted to hear more about a very exciting new novel which you wrote with the wonderful title of Atlas Hugged, which is obviously a play on Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. And it's a sequel to Ayn Rand, but very much with a different approach to things. So it's fittingly being gifted on its website, I understand. Is that true?
That's right. That's how anti-Randian it is.
There you go. So tell us about it.
Well, to begin with Ayn Rand and her novel Atlas Shrugged, she basically provided a cosmology, fictional cosmology, and moral system for individualism, greed is good individualism, and therefore had a huge influence on this, on perpetuating and spreading this worldview. It makes you want to think about fiction and stories and our species as a storytelling animal. Why is it that a fictional story, could have as much influence as the entire field of economics in inculcating this moral system? And this brings in all of the arts. And I quote Ayn Rand as saying, art is the essential medium for the communication of a moral ideal. Why is it that the religions are infused with the arts? So if you could communicate a meaning system or worldview artistically, such as through a novel, then please let's do that. And so that's what I've attempted to do with Atlas Hugged. That's everything we've been talking about, which I hope your audience has been entertained and informed a little bit, but they're also probably just overwhelmed by it all. They didn't assimilate everything we said, not even close. But in an extended,
they should read the book. It'll go straight into their mind. Yeah.
What did you say yesterday? And you said there's a hole in us where stories go through. What did you say?
Like the Dark Planet in Star Wars, where you have to shoot the laser beam directly into a tiny little slit. So I always imagine it that humans have a hole in their forehead through which ideas can get into the brain, and that hole is actually in the shape of a story. Stories work.
Yeah, so I would say that go ahead and read Atlas Hugged and see if that doesn't enter your head in a more powerful way than all this didactic prose. And one proof of that, Aaron, is that no novel is universally loved, because what causes us to accept or reject a story such as a novel, depends very much on whether we resonate to the meaning system that is being conveyed. If we resonate to the meaning system, we'll love the story, even if the storytelling is bad. And Ayn Rand's novel is not well written. Neither was B.F. Skinner's novel, Walden 2. These were not well written as novels, but they're still impactful because of the meaning system that they conveyed. If the story if you don't resonate to the meaning system of a story, you'll reject it no matter how well written it is. That's the degree to which the human mind is hungry for meaning systems and is imbibing them mostly in terms of stories, not in terms of philosophizing or intellectual discourse. And so to convey all of this in a story form is precisely what I intended to do with Atlas Hugged.
Well, I recommend to all our audience to definitely get their hands on a copy and read David's book. It's kind of interesting. We're ending now where we began, because you started off going into science, away from your father, whom you described as a kind of literary Everest. You weren't going to go in that direction. And now with your turn to novel writing and also your interest through your various activities with the Binghamton City School District and the design of educational programs for high school students that are at risk of falling out and falling behind and so forth. It seems like you're returning to a lot of your father's passions. And I just wanted to end by asking, is that something that evolutionary theory can account for? It's quite striking in the end. It's an interesting circle that you're making.
Well, I mean, it can be given a narrative form, prodigal son and all of that. And for me, it is definitely a homecoming. I didn't have to turn out that way. It did in my case. But yeah, and so in addition to the novel Atlas Hugged, I'd like to refer our audience to a pro-social world, which you mentioned. Just type in pro-social world and in a search engine, and then you'll get a portal into our efforts to evolve the future in real world settings. And we are working internationally. So if there's anyone that wants to check this out and get involved with working with groups or at any scale, then just get in touch and we'll evolve the future together. Not done to, with the help of science.
Well, David, it's been a great pleasure talking. I sort of feel like this is the continuation of a discussion, which is we haven't ended yet, and it's a marvelous conversation to have. I can't imagine anyone more thoughtful and interesting to have the conversation with. So I thank you for being with us this evening, your noon, and see you in the world of evolution and making the world a better place.
Well, thanks to you. And in the novel, it makes a whole lot of the cult of scholars, basically, the cult of scholars. And you are a wonderful member of the cult of scholars. So it's a privilege to be talking with you in particular.
Thank you so much. My great pleasure. Thank you. Good night, everyone.